The heavy oak doors of the Harrington Enterprises tower swung open with a groan that echoed through the marble lobby, and in walked Isabella Moreau, clutching a worn leather briefcase that held the last scraps of her family's dignity. Rain streaked down the glass walls behind her, mirroring the tears she refused to let fall. At 26, she had buried her dreams of art school under hospital bills and foreclosure notices, but today she carried something heavier than debt: the weight of a promise to her dying father. The security guard glanced at her soaked coat and the determination etched across her face, then waved her toward the private elevator without a word. As the doors closed, Isabella caught her reflection, pale, eyes too old for her years, and whispered the words that had kept her moving forward for months. "I will fix this." The elevator climbed 42 floors in silence, each ding marking another heartbeat closer to confrontation with Alexander Harrington, the man whose signature could either save or destroy what remained of the Moreau legacy. If you believe in kindness and second chances, hit that like button now, comment your thoughts below, share this video with someone who needs hope, and subscribe with notifications on. We're building a community that celebrates redemption. The executive floor smelled of polished wood and old money, a world Isabella had only seen in magazines her father used to bring home from construction sites. Her heels clicked uncertainly across the Persian rug as Alexander's assistant led her past oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. The office doors parted to reveal a cavernous space bathed in afternoon light, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city like a kingdom Alexander ruled from his mahogany throne. He stood when she entered, all sharp angles and tailored perfection, but something flickered across his features when their eyes met. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. Isabella had prepared for cruelty. The rumors painted him as ruthless, the corporate raider who'd absorbed her father's failing company like a shark swallowing minnows. Instead, he gestured to the leather chair opposite, his desk with a gentleness that unsettled her more than anger ever could. The briefcase trembled in her grip as she extracted the documents, spreadsheets yellowed with coffee stains, legal notices stamped in angry red, her father's shaky signature on loans that had grown monstrous with interest. Each paper represented another night she'd worked double shifts at the diner, another art commission she'd turned down, another piece of her soul traded for survival. Alexander took the folder without breaking eye contact, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment, warm, calloused in places that suggested he hadn't always sat behind desks. He flipped through the pages with practiced efficiency, but his brow creased deeper with every line. Isabella sat rigid, rehearsing the speech she'd practiced in cracked mirrors. She would offer to work off the debt, any position, any hours, whatever it took to keep her childhood home from auction. The silence stretched until she could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone unaccustomed to explaining himself. The original loan had been her father's desperate attempt to save his employees after a competitor underbid every contract. But the terms had been predatory from the start, terms Alexander's predecessor had written in blood-red ink. He laid the papers flat and met her gaze with something dangerously close to regret. The debt stood at $347,000, a number that had haunted Isabella's nightmares. But Alexander's next words shattered her carefully constructed armor. He would forgive it entirely, he said, every cent, if she would have dinner with him that evening. Not as payment, not as transaction, but as two people sharing a meal while he explained why her father's name still appeared in his personal prayer journal every Sunday. Isabella's world tilted. She had expected demands for collateral, threats of legal action, perhaps even the humiliation of being escorted out by security. Instead, this man who could buy her neighborhood twice over was offering absolution wrapped in the simplest of invitations. Her pride screamed to refuse, to maintain the dignity her family had clung to through bankruptcy and cancer wards. But curiosity, sharp and unexpected, curled around her refusal like smoke. Alexander watched the war play out across her face and added softly that her father had once carried him, drunk and broken-hearted. 3 miles home from a bar when Alexander was 19 and convinced the world had ended over a girl. The debt, he explained, had never been about money. It had been about finding the daughter of the man who'd shown him grace when he deserved none. The limousine that collected her that evening smelled of leather and rain-soaked city, a far cry from the city bus she usually took. Isabella had changed into the only dress she owned that wasn't stained with diner grease, a lavender silk her mother had worn to her own wedding, altered with shaking hands the night before. Alexander waited outside the restaurant, an unassuming Italian place tucked between skyscrapers, holding an umbrella against the drizzle. He wore the same suit but had traded the power tie for something softer, and when he spotted her, his smile transformed his face from formidable to almost boyish. The maitre d' greeted him by name, but Alexander requested the corner table by the window, the one usually reserved for couples celebrating anniversaries, and Isabella realized this wasn't about display. It was about creating space for truth. Over plates of handmade pasta and wine that probably cost more than her weekly wage, Alexander told her about the boy he'd been, privileged but lonely, raised by nannies while his parents jetted between continents. Her father, a subcontractor on one of Harrington's early projects, had noticed the teenager lingering at job sites, sketching building plans in the dirt with a stick. Instead of chasing him away, Mr. Moreau had taught him how to read blueprints, how to swing a hammer, how to treat workers like humans rather than line items. When Alexander's first love left him for his best friend, it was Mr. Moreau who'd found him crying behind the porta-potty and carried him home, singing off-key Italian lullabies his own mother had taught him. The loan, years later, had been Alexander's clumsy attempt to return that kindness, but corporate sharks had twisted it into something ugly. Isabella listened with her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, seeing her father through new eyes, the man who'd come home with sawdust in his hair and stories on his tongue, who'd built dollhouses for her from scrap wood and taught her that real strength meant lifting others even when your own arms shook. Alexander's voice cracked when he described visiting the hospital last year, sitting beside her father's bed while machines beeped their countdown, promising to watch over Isabella without ever revealing the connection. The debt forgiveness papers were already signed, tucked in his breast pocket like a love letter to the past. Dinner, he insisted, was simply because he'd wanted to meet the woman her father bragged about, the artist who'd painted murals on the children's ward walls using leftover house paint, who'd kept her family together with sheer will and cafeteria coffee. Walking back to the car, Isabella felt the city differently. The rain had stopped, leaving sidewalks slick and reflective, streetlights fracturing into golden shards. Alexander offered his jacket when she shivered, and she took it without protest, the weight of fine wool settling around her shoulders like acceptance. In the quiet between them, she found herself telling him about the sketchbook hidden under her mattress, filled with drawings she hadn't shown anyone since art school. Rejection letters crushed her confidence. He listened the way her father used to, completely, without interruption, eyes bright with something that looked suspiciously like awe. When the car pulled up to her crumbling brownstone, Alexander didn't try to kiss her goodbye. Instead, he pressed a business card into her hand with his personal number scrawled on the back. The next morning brought changes Isabella couldn't have scripted. A courier delivered a package containing her father's old tool belt, restored and oiled, along with a check that covered the back mortgage payments and a note suggesting she consider the Harrington Foundation's Emerging Artist Grant. The foundation, it turned out, had been funding community murals for years, projects her father had quietly recommended her for before his illness progressed. Alexander's office called not to collect debts, but to offer her a consultation position designing employee wellness spaces, work that would let her paint during daylight hours instead of scrubbing tables at midnight. The first project assigned her, transforming the executive cafeteria into something that felt like home, complete with a wall dedicated to her father's memory. Weeks blurred into months of cautious friendship. Alexander showed up at her mural sites with coffee and terrible jokes, learning to hold a paint roller without getting more on himself than the wall. Isabella discovered the man behind the headlines, collected vintage jazz records, and cooked Sunday gravy from his grandmother's recipe, burning it spectacularly until she taught him the proper way to stir. They argued about color theory and gentrification, about whether money corrupted or simply amplified what already existed in the heart. Late nights found them on her tiny balcony, city lights sprawling below like spilled constellations, talking about dreams deferred and the terror of hoping again. Alexander never pushed for more than she offered.